Welcome to our second focus session as part of a digital conference series on pluralism and responsibility, the media in a digital society, hosted by the Federal Government Commissioner for Culture and the Media under the auspices of the German EU Council Presidency. My name is Monica Jones. I'm an anchor at German International Broadcaster DW, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this program today. It is time to reflect. Approaches for a new EU media policy. That's the title of this session, which is hosted by the German Länder and the Institute of European Media Law. And as you can see, again, it is a digital conference, and there's a very obvious reason for that. Of course, it is because of the coronavirus pandemic. And it would have been nice to meet in person, no doubt about that. But there are advantages to this kind of conference, because instead of two physical conferences that were originally planned to take place in Bonn, we now have 7 online digital events. Of course, the first one was the kickoff event in July, where we gave you an overview of the issues at hand. And now follow 5 focus sessions that look at these issues in more detail. And then at the end of October, there will be the closing session. So we have 7 events in total. We already had one focus session 2 days ago looking at EU media policy coherency. And today we look at the possible best practice that Germany's federal media law model could provide to the EU, or perhaps even a kind of blueprint when we look at the Media State Treaty. That is what this focus session is about. There'll be tons of questions and answers given by various stakeholders, all coming from the media industry. And the session will be chaired by 2 leading figures of the Institute of European Media Law. One is Professor Ori. He's the director and chairman of the board of directors, and he'll be the one to steer the discussions and actually host this event as a moderator. He'll be joining us online. And here with me in the studio is Mark Cole. He is professor for media and telecommunication law at the University of Luxembourg. He's also director for academic affairs at the Institute of European Media Law in Saarbrücken, and he's standing right next to me. Professor Cole, hello, how are you today?
It's fine. I'm happy actually for the first time to be in Berlin again since quite a while, so everything's well.
Exactly, and you found your way here. We already heard about that it's not always that easy to find your way around in Berlin, but you managed. So I gave you a very brief introduction, but obviously there is so much more to tell about you and certainly about the EMR. Could you fill us in a little bit?
I will willingly do so, but I would like to first start to say we're very happy from the EMR and me personally that we can co-host this session, and thank you for the kind introductory overview, because I think it is indeed a good signal to also send something from the member states, in this case from the Länder, back to Europe. And that leads me to what we do at EMR, and me as a researcher, since basically I started doing research at universities, is to look into how media policy, how media law is shaped by the European Union, which may sound paradoxical because the European Union doesn't really have a competence to do media regulation. And the EMR was actually founded in 1990, which was directly after the creation of the so-called Television Without Frontiers Directive in the European Union. And in those days, nobody even referred to European media law because it was a non-existing area. And there was the feeling, by predecessors of mine obviously, that there should be research. And I was very happy when about half a decade ago I was asked to enter into that position, because it gives me the possibility to link a little bit academic research to practical applications. So looking at laws, how they function in reality, and also give some impulses from academia into the political sphere, how one could shape laws.
So now we know more about your motivation in particular. And your motivation is certainly interesting when we look at this context. I found out in your biography that for this year, for 2020 to 2021, the Council of Europe has appointed you to the Committee of Experts on Media, Environment and Reform. That sounds very grand. What exactly are you expected to do there?
Thanks, Grant. Let's hope it's going to be at least useful, the work we do. The abbreviation for this committee of experts is MSI-REF. Everything has to have an abbreviation, the Council of Europe, and already there it gets interesting because we often forget that we don't only have the European Union, which has an impact on media policy, but also the Council of Europe as the place where the fundamental right of the freedom of expression, Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, is in the focus. And so the Council of Europe is planning to offer a recommendation to its member states in a couple of years on how to shape media policy. Not actually to give the details of how the rules should look like, but to say what member states should consider when they create media laws. And that's why this committee of experts, as one of its jobs, has been asked to develop what we would call media and communication governance principles. So basically, what should a state do before they create a media law? Look at the stakeholders, look at the impact, and so on. And the idea is that the committee of experts prepares a draft, and then this draft gets obviously discussed by the member states' representatives, and the work just started. Due to Corona, not yet properly and full, because it was supposed to start in March. But very soon we have our first formal meeting, and then for the next 2 years, that's going to be one of my main research tasks, yes.
And so maybe a little bit of the session now, and the contributions to this session will actually then, you'll be able to make use of that then during that first meeting. So we're talking about new approaches to EU media policy. Mm-hmm. What sort of approaches are we talking about? Why do we need them? What are, in your view, the main challenges for EU media policy?
Actually, as a question, it's good to say not only what can we see maybe as a future EU media policy, or generally media policy in the future, but what is the challenge? And that's the right keyword, I would say. And the challenge for the European Union is manifold. I've already mentioned one, and that is the European Union takes care of a topic which in a way is not the core of the competency of the European Union. Those of you that followed the conference on Tuesday heard Anthony Whelan speak from the cabinet of von der Leyen, and he clearly indicated that the Commission is aware of the fact that media policy, in principle, is reserved to the competence of the member states, which in principle means the European Union should be doing nothing in the field or only very little. Now, as we all know, the European Union takes care of the idea of having a common market, a single market, and a digital single market includes also the exchange of ideas via the media. And so the one challenge is to find the right line between shaping media policy as an expression of protection of the fundamental right, which is what it breaks down to originally. We need to find a regulatory framework that allows people to express their opinions individually, but also collectively via the media, which is not competency of the European Union, and the other side, which is competency of the European Union, to say media are also a very big economic factor, and we want to have the possibility, for example, to see television signals across borders in Europe, or to have intermediaries able to offer their services without borders in the territory of the European Union. So that's the first challenge, to find the right balance between the two. And the second challenge, and that's one thing that I was wondering and reflecting about, especially in the last couple of days since hearing the session on Tuesday, we're not allowed to underestimate the complexity. So this comes in defense of all media policy and legislative persons. That accounts for the national level, for in Germany the Länder level, but also for the EU level. Things are not simple. It's not a simple input-output calculation where you say, if I change this little aspect, this is what comes out of it. What has become increasingly clear in the last decade is that media policy is so interrelated with other fields that if we do one thing on this side, for example, we change the data protection laws, it has an effect also on media policy. So the biggest challenge for me personally, if I look at the EU, is not only to respect the competencies of the member states, but actually to find the right approach to regulation which takes into account these interactions, this interconnectedness between different pieces of law, but also between the different actors in the field. So that is something, there is no simple answer. And sometimes people say, oh, the laws are too complicated, and once they're created, you don't really know how to apply them. But the reality is we should also say, that's true, but it's very complex. Think only of the potential impact that artificial intelligence will have also on the media consumption. Now, 10 years ago, we were talking about, should we include video sharing platforms in regulation of the media because they're similar to media? nobody was talking about artificial intelligence. Now we suddenly realize if we have regulation that covers certain new phenomena of the last decade, we still have not thought about the next 2 decades. And we should acknowledge this. And as an academic researcher, I feel very free to say that and to admit it. Nobody has the one answer what the future media policy should look like in 5 years or in 10 years. So there will be some trial and error, and there will also be things that will be done which just don't work in practice, but we have to at the same time acknowledge that something has to be done in order to keep the media policy framework functioning. And maybe the last point, how can we respond to that challenge in a way? Not yet giving the answer what it will look like in future, but one of the things I think that the EU media policy should take more into account than in the last 2 decades is, why are we actually doing this? Why do we regulate the media? Why do we think it is important to have an European common understanding? And there I would say we have to reflect this a little bit and say we have a value-based approach which maybe also differentiates us from certain areas in the world where things might be a bit different. And what values are these? There are certain core values. Admittedly, we have different cultural approaches in Europe, but we have certain core values which I think are common to us in Europe. And if we do that, one of the core values is fundamental rights. The freedom of expression is the core why we do media regulation at all. But that hasn't the aspect to say no regulation is the best because then everyone is free to say what they do and want. No, freedom of expression means it has to be a functioning exchange of ideas to make democracy work. And that only works if you also respect the rights of others, if you also consider things like disinformation, meaning it makes no sense if we have a huge marketplace of ideas, but nobody can control or regulate up to a certain extent the extreme things that can happen on such a marketplace. And that's, I think, a challenge, but at the same time might also be an avenue forward to sit down and reflect and make sure we base ourselves on the fundamental values. And on Tuesday it was said by Anthony Whelan, one of the core elements of the rule of law procedure which is being modernized is free and independent media. And I was really happy to hear that because I think that is important. And there, member states and the European Union can play together.
So free and independent media, freedom of speech, absolutely at the core of all the discussion, while at the same time, in order to have freedom of speech, freedom of expression, we need to have a common understanding, we need to have common ground, and that is where rules and regulation come in. I have one follow-up question, because you mentioned in the middle part of your answer about, that how many years ago, video on demand was, nobody was talking about artificial intelligence. In order to, and you also said that all these laws, it's all very, very complex, obviously. How big is the danger that we're constantly lagging behind because technology and user behavior is not waiting for us?
Well, it's not only a danger, it's a reality, I would say. So I think we have to accept that. That's one of the learning outcomes of the last 20 years. Trying to overtake the technical, the societal development by law is not going to work. So law will always follow. There will always be a delay, I think, personally. There's seldom a moment in history maybe where you can say there is a vision where the law can actually shape a development. But I don't see that as a big problem as long as the legal framework is agile enough, is flexible enough to allow for developments. So what we should not have anymore is that we have a new law which functions for 1 year or 5 years, but then basically has already completely been outdated. And one of the ways maybe to do that is in some areas not to go into too many details, but to set the fundamental, the rules which can apply beyond a specific new technology. Because let's also face it, we've had new things come, but we've also had things go. 20 years ago when I started teaching EU media law and how competition law plays a role, there was this sensational takeover of Time Warner by AOL. If I ask my students today in class, do you know what the company AOL stands for? Nobody knows except the ones that saw the movie where that played a role, you see? So also, it doesn't always mean that a new development necessitates a new law. We have to try and think about ways forward which can include developments which we don't foresee yet. Having said that, again, it's not easy, it's complex.
It's complex. Also, timekeeping is complex. Let's spend the last 5 minutes before we actually kick off the session and hand over to the chair, Professor Ori, with the content of this session. First of all, I said that it's basically it's hosted by the German Länder, and that is what we also want to discuss. What is the significance of the German Länder?
Well, I think it's one point to talk about complexities on EU level. Another point is to explain on the EU level what richness actually exists within the EU. And one thing that is really interesting, and many don't know this, is that in Germany, outside of Germany, I mean, in Germany we have an assignment of the competencies for the media policy to the Länder, which means we don't have one German media law, we don't have one German media policy, but it's 16 Länders which have to agree. Now, is that something bad? Well, sometimes it makes things more difficult in terms of finding an agreement. But we have exactly the same thing happening on the level of the European Union. And therefore, I think this finding a common understanding is something that the German Länder have been practicing and exercising since a long time. And surprise, surprise, for 30 years we've been having a functioning, coordinated media framework with the, what in Germany is called the Rundfunkstaatsvertrag, the Broadcasting State Treaty. And at one point the Länder said, this doesn't reflect reality anymore. We should move on and create something which is more overarching, and they decided to entitle it the Media State Treaty, the Interstate Treaty on Media. And that is something which includes new regulatory concepts. It includes new players, such as intermediaries, platforms, which have not been regulated per se on the level of the European Union. And I personally am of the conviction that a lot of the things that the German Länder found as a solution now, and I'm curious to hear what the stakeholders will say afterwards, actually could serve as a kind of a role model or at least influence the debate on the European level. And I told you before, we will have trial and error. And that means somebody has to move on and somebody has to make proposals. And sometimes it might be better to have this competition between the member states in that case, to come up with some regulatory approaches to test them maybe as well, and then to have kind of best practices which the European Union can use to feed into their process to say that might be a solution which actually works. It's not the first time that this happens, you know, like 25 years ago, the Germans had a law on the new media actors, the Telemedien, the telemedia, which in those days were called Informations- and Kommunikationsdienste, before the European Union passed the e-commerce directive. So there is this handover situation between states and the European Union, and I can only give the idea to all member states, read the Interstate Media Treaty, although I have to admit it's quite a long text. It's more than 100 paragraphs, so there's a lot to read, but it's worthwhile.
But everybody dealing with the law one way or another is used to reading large volumes. Last question. You mentioned the stakeholders several times now. Who are they?
Well, we had to make a decision with the Länder what we're going to focus on for a session like this, which is limited in time. And we decided to look both on established players and new players on the market. And we also took representatives, I'm very grateful that they took their time to share their views with us, which have been following the media policy development for quite a while. Because I think that's important not to forget where do we come from, how has media policy shaped. So we've got an association that takes care of the broadcasters mainly, which obviously look at their new competitors, video sharing platforms, on-demand providers, and how the regulatory field looks like there. We've got what we used to call the hardware industry. Manufacturers of products that we need, for example, to watch TV, which suddenly come within the scope of regulation in Germany and will certainly have a viewpoint on that. We have the platforms. We have somebody that will speak from the perspective of one of the big platforms, but also on how regulators have to learn to deal with this new landscape. And finally, we asked a perspective of the public service media. Why? Because I think Corona crisis especially has shown that the role of public service in this function that I mentioned at the beginning is essential, and we need to understand whether they can still thrive and survive in this new media environment. So those are the stakeholders we invited, and I'm sure it's going to be an interesting discussion.
Absolutely, I'm sure too. In total we have 5 stakeholders. Professor Ori, I can see him, is already ready to take the floor. One last thing from our side. This focus session is interactive, just like all the others before and afterwards, which means there is a live chat. Please do make use of it. Do submit your questions. I'm sure Professor Ori is looking forward to receiving them and then passing them on to the stakeholders. So, Professor Ori, at this point, I'd like to hand over to you, and we look forward to an exciting session, and we'll speak later again. Thank you, Professor Cole.
Yes, thank you very much, Monica Jones, Mark Cole, for preparing the ground. In the original planning, we had the idea of a physical congress in Bonn, as Monica already mentioned, and the idea was to have a marketplace installed where you could go around and gather information from different stakeholders. What is left are statements by video and short questions and answers in this specific format we have, and we try to go through items of the interstate treaty and the federal system in Germany, as Mark already explained it, the media state treaty, and get some aspects of it and discuss it. You can, as Monica mentioned, you can put your questions in the chat function of the system, and I will try to read it while talking and to give your questions to the speakers. I'm not sure, probably not all of your questions can be dealt with in this short period of time, but after our virtual walk across the marketplace, Mark will be on the center of this marketplace again, wrap things up, and he probably will also have the opportunity to answer some questions in his remarks. Well, then first we ask the perspective of Grégoire Paulin, whether further regulation are required for video sharing platforms for VSPs. Craig is Director General of the ACT, and he is going to explain that at the beginning of his video we are going to see right now.
Hi everyone, my name is Grégoire Paulin and I am the Director General of the Association of Commercial Television in Europe, also known as ACT. Now ACT represents 29 of Europe's largest commercial broadcasters, among which are ProSiebenSat.1, Sky and RTL. Commercial broadcasters of course play a vital role in the audiovisual ecosystem in Europe, reinvesting well over half of their revenues into original programming, as well as supporting more than 1 million jobs across the European Union. Now, today we're asked about video sharing platforms and whether further regulations are required. Well, we know that over the last 2 decades, of course, video sharing platforms have played an increasing role in the life of Europeans. And while this has provided a new means to inform, entertain, or educate, it has conversely been an instrument for native and foreign actors to massively disinform the European public, spread hate speech, undermine the democratic process, and lock people in echo chambers with algorithms that seek to comfort rather than challenge their own biases. While VSPs may not have been the instigators of such behavior, they have certainly profited from the advertising revenue and hidden behind freedom of expression to allow racists, bigots, and trolls of all sorts to prosper on their networks. All the meanwhile paying little to no tax in the European Union and contributing very little to the creative economy. As such, the question is not so much whether VSPs should be regulated, but when will they be regulated? Europe cannot be, on the one hand, imposing extremely strict rules on its broadcasters, while imposing almost no rules on mostly foreign-based VSPs. The European Union has recognized these dangers, particularly where minors are concerned, and amended the latest review of the AVMSD directive to that effect. But while the review contains 70 mentions of VSPs, the Articles 28A and 28B offer still a very loose and limited set of rules. As such, broadcasters expect a lot in the coming years from an extension of the AVMSD provisions to VSPs in some shape or form. This to ensure an equal protection of audiences for services that are essentially equivalent and a fair market for online commercial communications. Broadcasters also expect a lot from the upcoming Digital Services Act and European Democracy Action Plan in terms of imposing rules and sanctions on VSPs that contribute to spreading disinformation, and also as a means to ensure the anti-competitive practices that some of these services engage in are appropriately tackled. Europe has and will gain a lot from the digital transformation. But to do so, it must address the irresponsible behavior of certain VSPs that have consistently sought to put their community standards above European values and laws. The time for self-regulation is over. Thank you.
Yes, correct. Thank you for your point of view. Your last sentence was the time of self-regulation is over. Let me ask you questions. Broadcasters, private broadcasters love self-regulation as far I can see, for instance, in the field of protecting minors. So where's the difference between, let me say, good and bad self-regulation?
Well, hello, Stefan, and thank you so much for having me on. As you can see, there's been quite a change since the video has been uploaded. Well, look, there is a change in terms of if you look at the overall regulatory landscape for broadcasters, and if you look at the overall regulatory landscape for VSPs. Naturally, you'll see if you go through the AVMS, which essentially was targeted to broadcasting entities, you'll see a huge amount of rules there in terms of how we can essentially do advertising, what are the limits there, what kind of programs, rules with regard to anything that has to do with disability services, accessibility services. So to be sure, and you can ask any regulator across Europe who deals with media regulation, there's quite a thick amount of rules there for broadcasters to follow. And if you compare that to the rules that apply to VSPs today, I'm sure that anybody who's reasonable would concur that there are very much less. Now, of course, there is rule for a set of rules that are made and co-regulated with entities, etc., and that makes a lot of sense. But as many would say, I think you have to trust but verify. And that's really the key issue there, is that we have had self-regulatory mechanisms in the broadcasting sector. We've seen that they would work, and we would keep them. Where they haven't worked, I think the regulator has stepped in. VSP being a new entrant, a new phenomenon, as Mark laid out, and the law being a little bit always lagging behind, what we see is that essentially we are putting mechanisms in place. You will see today, for example, that the union will bring out its assessment of the code of practice on this information. But everybody who spends a bit of time on the internet will see that essentially this code of practice hasn't worked at all. There's still disinformation today, and there's probably a lot more during this COVID period. So I think the key there is to have regular assessment. And when the assessment is not successful, when the self-regulation doesn't deliver, that then essentially regulation should step in. And that's very much what we're calling for in several items regarding VSPs.
Okay. As I heard, your main objective is a level playing field between broadcasters and platforms. How should that be achieved? There are two ways. You could reduce strictness of regulation for content providers on the one hand, or by bringing the VSPs up to the level of broadcasters that are used for decades. What is the way you would propose?
Well, leveling down has been an argument for some years. Of course, we come from an industry that does like liberalization. The reality, though, is that, it's very hard to ask regulators to not regulate. It's part of their job. And you'll see that basically the natural tendency is to create more rules, including in our sphere, which essentially has become a lot more complex, as highlighted by Mark in his opening remarks. So essentially, I think we are looking, whether we like it or not, at a leveling up of responsibilities. The core issue is not so much about rules for us, rules for VSPs, it's about the public and how to protect the public. And I think that the core guidance, and then Mark was saying, what do we want to achieve in his opening remarks? Well, what we want to achieve is we want to make sure that no matter how people choose to access content, that they are afforded the same level of protection. And that's what we're facing today, is that you have people, depending on whether they're putting on their TV set or accessing our programs via our channels on social media and others, because, again, TV is not only about the TV set, it's everywhere. We do VOD services, we do OTT services, but we have editorial responsibility. So when you tune into our programs, you're protected. question is, when you tune into any other YouTube channel that's user-generated or other, are you protected to the same effect? Probably not. Actually, not at all. So the issue there is, how can we level up to ensure that, you know, all these audiences are protected in the same way? Because fundamentally, we want to ensure that this level of protection is the same. This should be a European goal and a national goal.
But in what areas, if you think there are, do you think we should allow a differentiation of rules, for instance, because of different technical issues or different commercial requirements compared to the content industry? I mean, platform and traditional content industry.
Well, I think looking at the areas, if you look at the differentiation, I think this is a great argument by platforms, right, which will always explain to you, oh, it's very technical, it's very difficult to do, etc. This was the main argument when we talked about this information at European level, that, you know, there were so many volumes of content, etc. But then, you know, COVID came around and suddenly you saw that this argument was no longer valid and that the platforms could actually do something about it. Whether they're successful about it is a different issue, but they can. So I think we're hiding around behind a lot of technical arguments which are not essentially valid, because the platforms have a much greater understanding and control over the traffic than they would say they do in public. So I don't actually believe that there are that many areas where technically it would be different. And, you know, we've seen with AVMS that, you know, child protection can be reinforced, and I hope to see these measures actually have effect when the directive comes into play. We've seen that, you know, on disinformation we could do a lot more. We've seen that on harmful content we can and should do a lot more. So actually, I'm not sure there are that many areas where, for technical reasons, the platforms shouldn't live up to the same standard. Because essentially, we're talking about trillion-dollar companies here, right? It's not like they can't put the amount of human resources, technical expertise to play.
Well, on Tuesday this week, we heard in a similar conference about copyright that the copyright war is over. We had the last few years in Europe. And one argument was, and I reflect this on what you just said, on the one hand, the 20th century content publishers, on the other hand, the modern 21st century platforms. And probably this discussion, and perhaps a little more again, will rise up when we discuss the DSA. What you already explained your goal you try to achieve with a level playing field on a high level. What can be done or should be done in the DSA discussion? Where could we go to?
All right, so the DSA is quite a wide discussion. As you know, it covers illegal content, harmful content, disinformation, looks also at ex-ante measures. So if we look at a few particular areas, well, I think the first thing is DSA is not about revolutionizing and changing around e-commerce. E-commerce was very clear about the type of actors it covered and didn't cover. And this is where it gets a bit technical, between active and passive players, notably. Today, I think the most, if not all players, in terms of VSPs or OCSSPs or whichever way you want to call them, can be considered as active. And therefore, they're not afforded the e-commerce protections that are there. There's a great body of jurisprudence that exists to that effect. And I think what's useful about the DSA is going to be able to clarify that, just like the copyright debate clarified that these platforms were doing a communication to the public. I think it will be good to comfort that and to be able to say that, you know what, in Europe, we've got a very good view of what is an active and a passive player, that we don't want any of the US-inspired Good Samaritan Act, which is absolutely, in our view, a completely wrong approach to how to regulate the online environment. And actually, the US itself is coming back on this approach right now. So there's a lot to be done there on the liability basis. and to reinforce because behind all of this, if you want, is the ability for people such as myself, but other industries, to reinvest and to keep a sustainable creative ecosystem in Europe. And let's not forget that these industries, the creative and cultural industries, which have been designated as strategic industries by the Commission, do actually contribute up to 7% of GDP per year, 7% of jobs in the EU. So it's quite a big issue to maintain and keep this creative ecosystem alive. This is not protectionism. This is just to make sure that everybody plays by the same rules. So this is just one example. We'll have examples, of course, in the competitive field with ex-ante rules, which are much needed, because we see a proliferation, as I've said in my intervention on video, an intervention of practices which are uncompetitive by nature and therefore create a market online which is less than perfect, should we put it this way.
Great, thanks for that. We could go on with a lot of topics and discuss it for a long while. We will do that, as Mark mentioned, in a complex situation later. Thanks for today. And I will walk to the next market stall, and it's marked with user interfaces from the perspective of regulation, providers and users. And in Berlin, in the studio, there is Karine Chardon, Managing Director, Consumer Electronics Division at ZVEE. The German abbreviation stands for German Electrical and Electronic Manufacturers Association. And we see her video.
The Interstate Treaty for Media has extended German media regulation to user interfaces. User interfaces are part of our everyday life. They facilitate navigation through different applications on smart devices, such as mobile phones, tablets, computers, car entertainment units, smart home panels, and televisions. Basically, user interfaces provide a control unit for functions and services provided by third parties. They can typically be adjusted to the need of each user. This personalization means giving the user a choice and providing a better user journey. In the near future, artificial intelligence tools will help user interfaces evolve even more. Whereas the availability and diversity of the media services depend on the platforms that bundle and carry the content, user interfaces are neutral. They can be compared to a helpful friend, enabling the user to find services and content provided by others. They help with the navigation and they give orientation, but they do not provide media diversity itself. So it is important to carefully assess to what extent user interfaces need to be regulated at all. Our petitum to all the member states currently in the process of lawmaking is: regulation should only be imposed in case of a potential risk for media diversity. However, if regulation is considered necessary, it needs to be kept at a proportional level according to the risk at stake for media pluralism, which is very low for user interfaces. Also, please do keep in mind the rapid development of technology. Don't hinder technical innovation that ultimately benefits the user by a rigid and retrospective legal framework. This will not help the user.
Karine Chardon in Berlin, hello. You had a really nice metaphor in your video, a user interface as a helpful friend. I liked it. And who in the world would regulate such a nice guy? And in your words, regulation means hindering new develops. Well, let's imagine the media authority in a country defined a certain content as public value, important for media diversity, and there is no button on the user interface to click on to see or hear that content. Don't we need a possibility to push our kind friend you described to remember he should be helpful instead of remaining defensive?
Well, first of all, I think there is a little misconception still, again, about the user interfaces, because your question is really highly hypothetical, so I would like to clarify two things. First of all, again, it is really the natural interest of user interfaces, and at this point, actually, we're not talking about a technical interface, but about a real interface for the user displaying or being a remote control. So the service of the user interfaces is really naturally to make all available content available from platforms, from the sources that are available to the user, all available content visible and findable for the user. Which reason should there occur that a user interface should hide any content from the user? That really is a hypothetical question, and I think on the contrary, it is the exact essence of the user interface to make all content visible and findable. And they do this by several means, actually. The time where every channel had a button on the remote control is far behind us. I think with digitization, we have seen the evolvement of the channels before we even went into the nonlinear sector. There are hundreds of channels on digital broadcasting. Not all of them have a button, and they are still findable. So what user interfaces do today, as I said earlier, is really flexibilize and give the tools to the user to find the content, and they do so by several means. They do so by enabling the user to scroll, by enabling the user to memorize favorites, by building lists, by rearranging, by maybe connecting a second device to the screen in order to have a more complex remote control, even to guide itself through the content. So all these tools are really available, and the time of the one button, one channel idea is far behind us, which is the reason why I think this idea is really still too rigid, and we are looking at the today's media behavior in a really retrospective way.
Karin, do you allow me to insist? I know what you say, one button first, ARD, two ZDF, and so on. Here in Germany, these times are over. But I don't think it's hypothetical. I know TV sets with also software-driven things. I know websites and platforms. And sometimes I'm sitting here trying to find something and say, where the hell did they hide it? I scroll through, and I would like to have valuable things be seen at the first glance. Perhaps in your eyes it might be hypothetical, but just to imagine if an important developer, an important manufacturer doesn't offer it, whatever reasons. So should then be a possibility for regulation for the media authorities to push him a little bit?
Well, first of all, what you just raised is the fact that you, a person, Mr. Ori, you have certain preferences and you want certain content to be found. But this is a subjective approach. So it's really difficult for the regulator, I guess, to find ways to give each user the specific benefits and specific tastes. So this really needs to be more flexibilized. I think it's a good idea to set a goal of findability the way that the Audiovisual Media Service Directive did. And I think with non-discriminatory approach as well, we have a very important tool and a goal which is prescribed by the regulation. But the exact means to how to arrange a menu and how to arrange buttons or how to arrange the logic of a user interface should really be kept to the market. For instance, if you look at the numerous public service broadcasting channels we have in Germany, these are already far beyond 20 regarding the TV, and I think we have more than 70 radio channels from public service, so that would be already 90 channels. How can you privilege those? How can you make sure that they are all found on the very first level? If you privilege so many content providers, among those, you will still have to organize a findability. So we cannot think in the same raster as we did before. It's really, I think, the time to let more flexibility guide us with regards to the user interfaces. And if I may add another thing, in Germany, the idea of the public value doesn't even stop at the public service broadcasting. It goes behind that or beyond that, because the debate in Germany even would allow probably a certain private sector channels to be part of the public value content that needs to be privileged. So again, if 80% of the market needs to be viewed or found at the first glance on the first level, this is quasi impossible. So I think really the user customization and the flexibilization of the user interface, which is already provided by most of the user interfaces, is key. And also it's important to not mix up the availability and the findability, because the availability is a means of infrastructure and platforms and bundling. In the media regulation in Germany, this was really separated from the regulation. So on the availability level, there need to be other rules, and as on the findability level, which is bound here to these interfaces, is really strictly about findability and visibility. And that's where I say the regulation should be more light touch and setting goals.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of topics we could discuss, AI and user interfaces and so on. We will do that. Not now, because time is flowing. Thank you to Berlin, and I will go to the next stall where we find Dr. Richard Burnley, Director of Legal and Policy with the EBU. His topic is what regulations are required so that content of general interest, especially that of public service media, not only broadcast media, could be more accessible. His video.
Good morning. I'm speaking today on behalf of the European Broadcasting Union, the Association for Public Service Media. The ongoing COVID crisis has highlighted more than ever the need for a clear and effective EU media policy. During the crisis, citizens and governments, like never before, have been crying out for access to trusted, objective information. We have seen, for example, absurd rumours about 5G masks causing COVID. Just that alone demonstrates the risk of leaving an unregulated web to do the job. At the same time, viewers have been turning to mainstream radio and TV in their droves for entertainment and culture, what you might call home comforts, to be reassured. Public service media in Europe have seen a huge swing towards their content during this time. Some news bulletins, evening news bulletins, have increased their viewing numbers and figures by up to 3 times. For local entertainment and culture, viewing figures have been up in similar numbers. So we have seen clearly the huge hunger for European regulated quality content. But at the same time, these traditions, these needs for European society, European media markets are under threat like never before. We have seen a kind of nuclear disruption to the European broadcasting markets on a massive scale. Billion-dollar globals serving up a diet of globalized content, gatekeeper platforms buying up production companies, productions, and even sports events. Of course, we welcome competition as European PSM, but it must be a fair fight. And European PSM must be enabled to fulfill its democratic and cultural role in European society. Like never before, we need a strong and clear EU media policy and vision that above all protects the delivery of public service media so they can continue to fulfill their role. There are many elements to this, of course, but I would like to touch on 2 of them. 2 core elements: inclusion of PSM on online platforms and prominence of European PSM. First, inclusion. PSM, public service media, must be included on all traditional and new platforms, the essential facility infrastructure to reach audiences in the future. This is a question of competition law or else new ex ante rules like the existing must carry rules for telecoms. Second, public service media must be findable by the audience. It can't be lost in a sea of global interest. It must be prominent in search lists, in apps and on the user interface. This second element, prominence, it builds on the basis already laid out in the AVMS directive. That is currently a discretionary provision for member states to safeguard general interest if they wish to do so. Well, member states need to take the initiative. They need to take the initiative now. We've seen positive developments in Germany and in the UK. Other member states need to follow suit quickly. Providers of TV user interfaces must be obliged to ensure the findability of general interest content, both linear and non-linear, because European citizens want to see and hear us now and in the future. Society deserves objective information and quality content. The EU and its member states have a duty to protect freedom of expression and European democracy in a fair and responsible online environment. Let's then build a robust and fair regulation of the European digital world together. Thank you.
Would you accept that on an EU level, meaning you argue in favor of inclusion and findability of PSM? Is this PSM only, or could a regulatory framework also include other types of media providers, intermediaries, commercial broadcasters in such a regime?
Thank you very much, Stefan. And firstly, thank you so much for the organisers for this very important event today. It could not be more important in our view. Yes, so I think inclusion of quality European media, the protection, as Professor Cole has said, of free independent media in Europe, it requires regulation, it requires protection, and there is an onus on the member states to ensure the inclusion of general interest broadcasters on online platforms, be they virtual OTT platforms, be they technical interfaces, and the findability of general interest content providers. Now that includes public service media, but it also includes quality European independent media broadcasters. It is, in our view, for the national regulators to define what is general interest content and the thresholds that have to be met. But yes, we would certainly see that it would not just be public service media, but also commercial broadcasters that satisfy those thresholds.
Let me answer this question from a different perspective. You mentioned the role of PSM and other public value content for the fundamental values in Europe, right up to the point of the essential building stone for our democracies. That is very important and a very high argument. When you are balancing PSM with the commercial interests of platforms and user interfaces. But does really every piece of content of PSM and others meet that level of being highly important for democracy? Where do you draw the line?
It is the uniform service of public service media that performs that role. So it's the actual service itself that is public interest, as taken as a whole and taken with its variety of content, its objective news and information, and also the cultural content, which of course should reach all sections of society, both majority and minority. So no, I don't think you can split up the service into different aspects of or different types of content. However, we would accept that virtual platforms might do that, and they might take certain disaggregated content, and it's that content as well should be protected under the rules and should ensure that also there is adequate brand attribution to that content.
The last short question, time is running. In Europe, there are significant differences how to deal with the inclusion and findability of public value content. You mentioned Germany, you mentioned the UK. What should be put into the European legal toolkit in the future?
It's a very broad question. I think generally we would first of all call on member states to follow, in fact, the Germany lead in terms of their findability rules and in terms of implementing AVMSD and the idea of findability of public service media content. I think we should not underestimate the importance of this, and to the extent that the DSA, the Digital Services Act, can complement those rules or push those rules in different ways in order to protect European media, European broadcasters, then yes, complementary rules to get us to where we need to be. I mean, I find it unacceptable, the idea that it's all too difficult and we shouldn't do that. It's something I hear sometimes from my children about their homework. I think the fact that something is difficult underestimates the cleverness of our regulators, the cleverness of our court system.
And I don't think Mark was understood in the way we don't make our homework as the Institute and the media politics in Germany and in Europe. Time is over. I regret, Richard. Thank you for your perspective, and I have to mention that we have 2 or 3 questions. One is back to interfaces, that is perhaps on a two-way communication to be answered, and 2 questions I gave already to Mark for the session in the end. So your questions are read, but the time is not there to hand over those questions right now. I go to the next market tender, who is Michael Neuber, Government Affairs and Public Policy Manager at Google, and we ask him the questions of how transparency and the discrimination regulations of the Media State Treaty are implemented by Google in practice or will be implemented in the future. His video.
Hello everyone, I'm Michael Neuber from Google. We are really happy to take part in today's discussion about approaches for a new media policy with you. In view of the advance in digitization, we welcome a modernization of media law. Digitization and the increasing convergence of media have remarkably been changing the way media can be accessed and used. Securing a diverse media landscape and the unhindered access to media content is therefore important. For the first time, the new Interstate Media Treaty attempts to extend the rules that previously existed for broadcasting services only, seeking to include complex new types of digital services. We will now have to assess the new legal terms and definitions being introduced, as well as having to deal with the question to whom they apply. Where concerns legal certainty, yet another aspect seems important to us. It touches upon the relationship between the new rules and the European law, especially with regard to the e-commerce directive and the AVMS directive and the country of origin principle laid out therein. The EU Commission had expressed concern that the Interstate Media Treaty could possibly restrict cross-border services. The question is not so much whether or not the new rules will be applicable to us, but whether they are compliant with European law and who is to give the answer. For intermediaries like Google, transparency towards the users of our services as well as towards website operators is crucial, not least because their credibility depends on it. It doesn't work without transparency. It is important for practical reasons so that websites can be technically prepared in such a way that they can deliver relevant and discoverable information to users. However, transparency must also be dealt with responsibly. If it's too general, it can become overwhelming and thus useless. An overly detailed explanation would not lead to more transparency, but instead opens the door to external manipulation attempts. This would eventually result in a bad user experience, and also users wouldn't get their best answer to the query. Also, company and trade secrets must be protected. It would therefore be helpful to clarify in the statutes for media intermediaries that compliance with the transparency provisions of the Platform to Business regulation will be regarded sufficient, also with regard to the transparency requirements of the Interstate Media Treaty. The requirements for non-discrimination against media content mark an essential element of the new rules. Here we need a realistic view on how things really work when searching for and finding media on the internet. Since internet intermediaries do not offer the same editorially designed content for a large audience, they significantly differ from cable network operators or broadcasters. Identical search queries at different times in different places can result in different search results and different ways of displaying content. We therefore see a great challenge in deciding whether or not this would be discrimination within the meaning of the law. The objective reasons referred to in the law as justification play an important role here. In the end, it will be important in practice that this intention of the legislator is not actually misused, for example, to enforce copyright or ancillary copyright claims from content providers. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Michael Neuber in the studio in Berlin. Hello. Quote, transparency needs to be dealt with responsibility, meaning not too much transparency. But you can create it in different ways, not only by providing information written on a website. One question is Google willing to give access to data and algorithms by opening, for instance, an API for scientific research, and to media authorities, of course, under the condition that trade secrets are kept and will not given to competitors.
Well, thanks for having us. Thanks for the question. Well, we are already offering a whole lot of transparency when it comes to the questions around our algorithms or how things work. We have launched years ago already our How Search Works website, offering a lot of information to users, and everyone who is interested can look up how actually we present our results for users. We have also launched just in June of this year a How YouTube Works website, offering loads of information to users on how our systems work. The question, and I mentioned it also already in the video, is to which extent is it really useful to explain or to give information on the algorithms? It can be open a floodgate for manipulation, and this would actually lead to the paradox situation that what you are looking for and what your query is not going to be answered well, and the game is going to be the system is going to be gamed by bad actors. So we do a lot here to offer transparency to users already.
But an API for scientific researchers who are under control, who sign an NDA?
Well, we have an open data project already running, and this has given a very big amount of data already to the open community. We opened our info on the GitHub blogs where all the open data can easily be accessed.
Thank you. And next question is, you mentioned some points with relevance for here in Germany, for example. The understanding of terms in the text, in those 100 and whatever paragraphs, and legal certainty. I will leave these German topics aside. One is relevant for discussion on the EU level, the obligation of non-discrimination on the one hand, and the obligation of paying licenses fees for content on the other side. I understood that for Google, it is not a form of discrimination when refusing to include content because you don't get it for free. But isn't that an abuse of dominant market position?
Well, I don't believe so, and this is also already addressed in the Interstate Media Treaty. It is not a question of discrimination, I guess. It's, if you are searching for something on the internet, you can be searching for a whole lot of things, and we are trying to collect the information of the world and then give it to the user and be as useful as possible. We see that, and as I mentioned in the introductory video, you can have the same query about the same thing, but being in a different location and having different things in mind that are relevant to you, which produce another outcome of your query and your search. So to come to your question, it's natural that there is differentiation, and the law even allows for it. As I mentioned, there are objective reasons that we must be able to count on. Of course, one reason would be to be able to abide by the laws and not be unsure there. And the other reason would be not to be exposed to damage claims. That's a natural right of every company. So this is a perfect objective reason that's recognized by the Intermediate Treaty as well.
Another wide area of discussion, and I would have some other questions, but again, time is running, and we must end the discussion for today, but I'm sure we will continue that discussion in some other form. Thank you very much.
Looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
And I will switch over finally to hear Dr. Daniel Knapp. He is the chief economist at IAB Europe. This is a European-level association for the digital market and advertising ecosystem. He is co-founder for firms in Düsseldorf and London, and as you spoke about transparency, Daniel is a member of the board of the Institute of European Media Law. This has to be mentioned. And we asked him about opportunities and risks of the Media State Treaty in terms of best practice for the discussion, of course, on EU level, his video.
Hi, my name is Daniel Knapp, and I'm the independent chief economist at IAB Europe. The new Interstate Treaty achieves an important feat. It ends a kind of incrementalism that has hampered other regulatory regimes, which for the last decades have tried to fit the ever more complex reality of media and its social, economic and political implications into legacy definitions. The distinction between media platforms, user interfaces and media intermediaries overcomes this. This distinction acknowledges that media don't just take place on the interface of the screen, but also on different infrastructures and the powers of modulation that come with it. Media today have become the combination of content data and an algorithmic mode of distribution. At the same time, media markets have become global and local media ecosystems embedded into wider market forces. How this Interstate Treaty recognizes the interplay of these forces goes further than other regulatory regimes that are currently taking shape in Europe, which try to pursue a similar mission and try to align the legacy world of media with newer trends. For instance, if we look at Ofcom in the UK, we can see that increasingly they're being granted power to ensure that online platforms will comply with minimum standards in video sharing, and even that data and algorithms of platforms are being released so that Ofcom can look at them and investigate them. Now, a key issue in this macro world now of redefining media and being all-encompassing is how to put it really into practice. A main challenge will be to obtain the relevant data and to analyze it. For regulators, it means setting themselves up in an entirely different way. Algorithms are often trade secrets, and even if they are being released, handed over, you cannot necessarily read how they affect markets overall. You need new approaches of data gathering, of experimentation, of testing and figuring out how the complex interactions between all the factors that are now defining markets actually work in practice. To succeed in this new regulatory world, the media sector might be advised to take learnings from other regulatory domains, such as high-frequency trading, where increasingly the financial regulators are working with private firms and public-private partnerships to tap into private state-of-the-market tools and services to analyze and understand these markets. Often such tools require a lot of development and a lot of R&D and are highly costly to build, and regulators can't necessarily afford this. So this might be a template, or an avenue at least, to consider for European regulators to take the now German interstate treaty model and expand it into Europe, and to ensure that regulation and insights into markets is fair, transparent, and accountable. But overall, we're going to see a shift, or have to see a shift, in how regulators operate if they want to really tackle the complexities of these new media markets. This will be an empirical question and an exciting one, looking forward, where industry and politics can work together to make this happen in a sustainable way. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you. You stressed practical aspects and the complexity of the digital media market. And that did surprise me. You compared with high-frequency trading in the economic world. Can you give us an example why you did that comparison?
Absolutely, Stefan, yes. We all know the world has become incredibly complex, not just in the domain of media, but everywhere. And as I tried to outline in my introductory statement, there are often hidden market forces at play which cannot be captured by human cognition and the existing tools and methods of understanding markets that we conventionally have at our disposal. So, for instance, in the financial world, high-frequency trading, so the high-volume algorithmic trading of stocks, can, as we've seen in the financial crisis 2008-2009, introduce flash crashes, micro-market distortions or sudden market distortions that are not conceivable with the human eye. But there are monitoring tools available that, from the private sector, that track these markets and understand the market forces, motivations, and kind of augment human cognition to make the market forces visible to human agents. And this model has been translated in the regulatory domain, where regulators are now using best in market tools, like market participants themselves, to try to understand those markets. I believe that this is increasingly going to be important in the domain of media as well, as the interstate treaty defines it. We can start with very simple things. For instance, Google has stressed that algorithms are a trade secret. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't understand how they operate. For instance, there's the domain of SEO, or search engine optimization, where specialists in the domain of marketing try to run little experiments and tricks to kind of, in a sense, reverse engineer not what the algorithm is, but how it reacts if it's exposed to certain stimuli or market forces. Separately, in the domain that I come from, digital advertising, or in particular programmatic advertising, the automated high-frequency trading way of doing advertising, is also extremely complex and has a very long value chain. And here again, it is important to understand, how do these different actors interact with each other? How is knowledge being shifted away from, let's say, publishers or advertisers to intermediaries, and how is this knowledge being used to not just act on markets, but to shape these markets? And I believe that new methods and tools from the domain of data science can help and empower regulators to better understand this market before we start regulating in the first place.
That leads to another question. Are the media authorities across the EU equipped for such a complex and fast-changing situation? Has GDPR not shown that the actual assignment of powers and resources is maybe the key factor and equally important to the rules themselves.
That is a great point, and as Mark Cole outlined in his introductory statement, law and regulation will always be chasing market forces. But we are risking that this gap is becoming not only wider, but that we are coming in a position where we cannot even recognize the gap or recognize the forces that shape the market. So we at least have to try. It does not mean that regulators need to become institutions that have expensive data science teams set up. This will be a losing endeavor. But it means we should smartly think how we can take insights and tools and use them to make better sense of the market. For instance, we have for a very long time already used market intelligence in the regulatory domain, which is, for instance, looking at audience shares and revenues of media companies. This is going to remain important, but these are increasingly becoming blunt tools. What I'm arguing for is to review and expand the tools without needing to completely change the financing of a regulator. But that also means having, and I come back to another term that Mark Cole used at the beginning, a more agile approach. And I'm not sure how we used that term, whether it was a deliberate choice, because in the software development world, agile means something very specific. It means approaching a problem in a very structured but very fast way to make decisions to test, adapt, and learn. And one of the main challenges is now that the market forces that we're seeing, they're not static, they're changing all the time. So we need to find a way to listen into the markets and to keep close tabs on them as they change.
Well, thank you. We are in time. And I know, Daniel, from your internal presentations you gave us, that this is a broad field and we could go into very interesting details, but again, not in this session. So thank you very much. And I can hand over to Monica Jones and Mark Cole again. For me, it was a very compressed kind of interview. We had so much topics and so much questions we could have asked, but that's the time we had.
Indeed. Professor Ori, thank you so much. I have to say, I didn't expect time to fly that fast listening to such complex issues. I mean, we're talking about rules, regulation, something that as an outsider you're not always confronted with in such detail, but it was really riveting listening to it. And before we let you go, though, we hope that you stay for the remaining 15 minutes because Mark Cole already told me that he might hand over to you here and there. Let me just ask you, I mean, I know myself that being in the position of moderating and asking questions to various people, it's sometimes very difficult to keep track of everything that's been said. But may I ask you anyway, is of those last sort of 45 minutes, what stuck out for you when you listened to all those various stakeholders and their particular views?
Sometimes it's the same procedure as on every panel, but that is in the short time everybody has to stress and to make his point. If you go deeper into the discussion, then I'm quite sure, and that is what our institute does, and what I like when you have smaller groups and the stakeholders open themselves, then you can find compromises and ideas. You could give the regulators, for instance, what we discussed with Google and transparency. I'm quite sure that could in the end be a point where Daniel also would be happy and saying, okay, I can have as an analyst a deeper insight, but I don't give it to the market and to competitors. That is a long discussion, and we heard just 100% positions in that marketplaces, but that was it's done for to stress the positions.
Indeed. Indeed, Professor Ori, and as I mentioned, just stay with us because I would like to include Professor Cole now, who's obviously also been listening to the entire discussion. And I have to say, I don't envy anybody who has to regulate anything because you can't please everybody. We heard only five different stakeholders very clearly presenting their worries, their needs, their desires. What kind of input did you get for your further work now in reshaping EU media policy?
Or at least in giving impulses in the reshaping, because we're not yet in the position to actually help formulate. Although I have to say, I think that's one of the elements that came out of this discussion. I mentioned the complexity at the beginning, and the complexity also goes down to the amount of stakeholders we have. Now, this is not a totally new situation that we only realize now. It's been there since a couple of years. But like 25 years ago, you would maybe have the public service media and the commercial broadcasters around the table that you have to mediate between when you try and find a common solution. And then maybe you would have the publishers. But now we have people around the table, and I thought that became quite clear in this discussion just now, that don't actually have the same starting ground. They are not all traditionally publishers. They're not all traditionally set up to have an impact in public opinion making, at least not the way their business models were launched. But they have been invited, whether they want or not, around the table because the regulator sees that they have an impact on this. And so my main takeaway is not so much content-wise, but I've realized how important it is, both on policy area but also on academic level, to bring together stakeholders which may not have naturally been either allies or competitors, to get a common understanding, what are we trying to achieve, and what could each of you, in an ideal world, what could each of you contribute to that common goal? Right.
And of course, one of the key phrases that certainly stuck with me was the regulators regulate. And I made a note for myself, and I hope this is not an end to an end, but a means to an end. Of course, we did have participation as well. Yes. Even though this was a really interesting discussion, we did get some questions through. And I'd like to pass one on to you right now, Mark. Netzpolitik.org asks, and it's a very sort of cryptic question, but I'm sure you can make sense of it. Risk for media pluralism posed by the gatekeeper function of online platforms, in brackets Google, FB, Facebook.
And there again, I think actually it's very good that we have this interactive function as well today, even though we have a limited period of time, because that's an aspect that has not been touched very much until now in the input, even what I said at the beginning. When I talked about the main values or the main reason for regulation, one of the key terms that we have not mentioned indeed is media pluralism. And so this question is absolutely right to say, do we not have a completely new situation of risk or even threats to what we commonly know as media pluralism by new players, by new stakeholders that we just heard? And when I say new, I don't mean like since yesterday, but the last decade. And I would answer, yes, there is a risk, but the first thing we need to do to answer that question is to say, what's media pluralism today? And that comes back to what I said initially. It is no more so clear-cut. We used to have sector-specific regulation where we had different regulation for press publishers and TV broadcasters, each of them contributing to pluralism on the media market. Today I would answer that question, yes, there is a risk if we understand media pluralism as an overarching expression of how you can manage to have a situation where people have access to diverse content from different players reflecting different positions, but also respecting different levels. So, for example, it might be natural that I'm very careful with the expression, some service providers have maybe a more global perspective. But things happen locally. The rules for Corona in schools are different between schools that may be 200 kilometers apart from each other. So people also need information on local and regional level. And if you take that all into media pluralism, meaning different stakeholders, different perspectives, different opinions, but also different areas that are covered, I think there is a risk. And to answer the question, can one approach that risk? Can one answer to it? Yes, I think one can. And I think regulators, for exactly that reason, are saying, if platforms until now were under the scope of the e-commerce directive, it was because they were mainly actors on a commercial market. now that they have become relevant for people's choice in how they access media content or any type of content, they actually become a player in that field. And not because they, in a negative way or in a deliberate way, want to select or pre-select opinions. I'm not saying that at all, but even without maybe wanting, they have become relevant. The question poser said gatekeepers, yes, relevant channels to access information. And that's why we have to respond to that.
And that basically also covers a question that one of big German media outlets, broadcasters, the ZDF, wants to know about the balance between safeguarding pluralism and business freedom. It falls into that as well.
That's a very interesting question as well, because it shows how deep into the details you have to go if you then look at the issues. You can't just say media pluralism very generally. And it even refers to a very recent, 2 weeks ago, decision by the Court of Justice. So that's one element that we also have not reflected very much. We'll have rules, and these rules need to be enforced. And I think that is key. You said before, regulators should not be regulating as a means per se. And I agree absolutely with that. And it sounds quite interesting to say regulators always regulate, otherwise there are no regulators. That's true. But to be more serious, there might be one avenue to follow for the future is to give regulators a bit more of leeway, because the agility or the flexibility is not as high on legislative level. Think of an EU directive, how long it takes until that is in place, then it needs to be transposed by member states, then it needs to be applied in practice, and here we come to the question again, and then there will be a situation where there is a conflict between stakeholders and it goes to a court. The courts on the national level discuss it and it goes back to the Court of Justice on the European level. And we might talk, and in that case it is like that, in the Mediaset Vivendi case, a competition law cartel case, that was like a decade. The market a decade ago did not include AI, but it also did not include Google in the way it is on the market today. The discussion about that decision is interesting, because basically what the Court of Justice said, the Italian rules were not sufficient, or they were not actually fulfilling the goal of upholding media pluralism. So you could read that decision as meaning that member states have less possibilities to actually include rules in their national laws for media pluralism. But I read it the other way around. There is an expression by the Court of Justice where it said media pluralism is the goal, and then it says, and it cannot be stressed enough how relevant it is. It's the prime goal of media regulation. Maybe the Italian solution, the way it was done in that case, was not correct, but it has acknowledged, the Court of Justice, that achieving pluralism in the content market, I purposely say content market, not media, is one of the prime goals. And yes, I think one of the ways you can look at the interstate media treaty here in Germany is it's a new way of trying to achieve pluralism.
And you mentioned that stakeholders, they're not always seeing eye to eye, certainly don't always share the same interest. I think that also became very clear. And that brings us to competition. And we heard earlier Richard Burnley from the EBU calling for fair competition. But then again, can you be fair to everyone, all the stakeholders at the same time? And there we have a question from the live chat. When it comes to the Digital Services Act and media regulation, how can be ensured that all small and middle-sized enterprises are not affected as hard as the regulation is meant to affect the so-called gatekeeper and the big players?
That's also an element that one has to take into consideration. Let's call them, and I don't like the expression, but let's call them collateral damages. So not only when you have a piece of law, you have to consider what impact does it have to the left and to the right, but you also have to ask yourself what impact does it have on the different market players. And we heard that, for example, implementing solutions on filtering or some form of curation of content is easier if you've got multi-billion-dollar investment money compared to maybe a very small startup platform. And one of the things we want to have in Europe is diversity, but also diversity of players. So if we do rules which basically manifest the market the way it exists now and don't leave loopholes open for companies to start up with new ideas, that will be bad. And the answer is, we know that. We know that from competition law. There's things like de minimis rules where it says if the impact on the market is really small, because, for example, the state aid is so small, it's acceptable. We know it from excluding small and medium-sized enterprises from certain rules, or maybe for a certain period of time. That you say we give them an establishment phase on the market, and if they survive that establishment phase, well, then they have to maybe have more stricter rules. But let's also be honest. A perfect equilibrium fair for everyone to the same amount is not possible. And it's not necessary. If we break down rules to why do we want to have them, then yes, they might put certain players into a better role than others. But what we're not advocating for as EMR or me as a researcher is to say we need one law and one solution and it fits all of the players on the media market. That's not. It means we need one reason why we do the laws. We have to keep that goal in mind, and then we have to empower different elements. And not only the end user, maybe that as a finishing thought from my side. Many say in the future world it's the user that has to be able to decide all these things. Honestly speaking, I think the user sometimes is overwhelmed. Look at all the things we learned today. So up to a certain area, regulation also has to help the user by putting the players which have more power into the right position.
It's certainly not fair to leave all the responsibility with the user. Mark, you asked me to give you an idea about timing. I'd say with 60 seconds to go, briefly tell us, where do we go from here?
I think what we need to do, and even though we're in the midst of the process of DSA, we need to re-reflect what we're trying to achieve. I said that already, and there are some key expressions that were said today. Rules have to be fair. We need the players to be accountable for what they do. We need to have transparency. And for example, this trilogy of expressions as a regulatory goal is something that could apply in several fields. It could apply in data protection law, it can apply in media law, it can apply in platform regulatory field. So I think we should continue to think about the core topics. These three I think are good regulatory goals. And the last that I would want to say is, let's not create rules that we cannot enforce, or when we create the rules, also think about the enforcement dimension, because it's useless to have rules that cannot be enforced.
That's a nice way to wrap this up. Professor Mark Cole, thank you so much. Professor Stefan Ori, we didn't get back to you, but thank you so much for steering this very, very interesting discussion. And very briefly for everyone, because time is definitely up now. Obviously, this is the end of the second focus session, and it will not just disappear somewhere in nirvana. This is actually everything that's been said today, and in the previous focus session, the kick-off one, and the focus sessions to follow will feed into the work in Brussels very, very directly. I can tell you that there are 3 more focus sessions coming up on the 22nd, the 24th of September, and the last one on the 1st of October. And don't forget to pencil in the closing session on the 29th of October. Thank you very much for joining, and stay safe.